The man at the door was crying before I even said a word. I had just finished a 12-hour shift at the hospital. Not as a doctor, not as anyone important. I was pushing a supply cart down the corridor of St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto, restocking linen closets and emptying waste bins the way I had done every weekday for the past 2 years. At 64 years old, after everything that had happened, that was my life. I was not complaining. At least, I was trying not to. It was a Thursday in February, one of those gray Toronto afternoons where the cold settles into your coat before you even step outside. I had clocked out, pulled on my jacket, and was walking toward the staff exit near the ground floor when I heard someone behind me. "Excuse me," the voice said. Is your name Hartley? Thomas Hartley?" I turned around. An elderly man was standing a few feet away. He was tall, maybe 75 or 80, well dressed in a long wool coat, with white hair and the kind of posture that suggested he had once been a very confident man. But his eyes were red, his jaw was trembling, and he was looking at me the way people look at someone they thought they would never see again. "Yes," I said slowly. "I'm Thomas Hartley." He put his hand over his mouth. He closed his eyes for a moment, and I genuinely did not know if he was about to faint. I stepped toward him, instinct from too many years watching nurses work, and touched his arm. "Sir, are you all right? Do you need me to call someone?" He shook his head. He took a breath, and then he said something I did not understand at all. "You look exactly like your father." I stood very still. "My father passed away 11 years ago," I said. "I know," the man said quietly. "I've been looking for his family ever since. My name is Thomas Hartley, and I want to tell you about my father, because I did not know him the way I thought I did. I grew up in Sudbury, Ontario, the son of a man named Gerald Hartley, who worked as a mechanic at a garage on LaSalle Boulevard for 31 years. My father was not a complicated man, or so I believed. He got up early, went to work, came home smelling of engine oil, ate dinner at the same time every evening, and watched the news before bed. He was not expressive. He did not talk much about his feelings, his past, or his opinions on very much at all. He was a Northern Ontario man of his generation, and that is the only way I know how to describe him. My mother had passed when I was 17, and after that it was just the two of us and my older brother, Raymond, and my younger sister, Carol, in a small house on a street where every house looked the same. My father held that house together without ever asking for recognition, working overtime whenever one of us needed something new, winter boots, a school trip, a hockey registration fee he could barely cover. He never said it was a sacrifice. He simply did it. He retired at 67 and moved to a smaller apartment on the east side of Sudbury. He died at 73, quietly, of a heart attack in his sleep, in a bed in that apartment. There was no drama, there was no big speech. He was there, and then he was not. And the three of us buried him on a gray November day, and then we drove back to our separate lives. That was 11 years before the man in the wool coat stopped me outside St. Michael's Hospital. I had ended up in Toronto because of a slow unraveling that I will not blame entirely on my brother and sister, though I would be lying if I said they played no part in it. After my wife Margaret passed 3 years after my father, a stroke that came without warning one morning while she was making coffee, I was living in the house we had shared in Barrie for 22 years. Our children were grown and gone. My son Derek lived in Calgary. My daughter Patricia lived in Vancouver. They called on birthdays and at Christmas, and that was about the shape of it. Raymond and Carol had always been close to each other in the way that siblings sometimes form a private alliance that excludes the third. I had never quite found my place inside that alliance, but it had not mattered much when we were scattered across the province living our own lives. It began to matter after Margaret died, when I found myself alone in a 5-bedroom house with a mortgage I could not carry on my pension alone, and when Raymond suggested, gently at first, that perhaps I should think about selling. I was not opposed to selling. What I was opposed to was what came next. My father had left a small estate, the contents of the Sudbury apartment, a modest savings account, and a storage unit full of tools and old furniture. The three of us were supposed to divide it equally, and that is what we agreed to at the kitchen table after the funeral. But months passed, and Raymond, who had taken on the task of coordinating the estate because he had power of attorney, began to change the accounting. Small things at first, a deduction here for expenses I had not agreed to, a valuation of the tools that seemed low, a suggestion that the savings were less than I remembered because of fees I had not known about. I raised it once, clearly and directly, in a phone call with both of them on the line. Raymond told me I was confused. Carol said I was being difficult at a difficult time. I was 61 years old, recently widowed, and I did not have the strength to fight them then, so I let it go. When I sold the Barry house and moved to Toronto to be closer to Derek's cousin, the only family connection I had in the city, I took an apartment in Scarborough that was smaller than anything I had lived in since I was 20. I had some savings, a small CPP payment, and eventually the hospital cleaning job, which was honestly fine. It was honest work. It kept me busy. It kept me from sitting alone in that apartment, thinking about Margaret. I was not a bitter man. I want to be clear about that. I was a tired man. I was a man who had decided that the remaining years of his life were going to be quiet and decent, even if they were small. I had made my peace with small. And then a stranger started crying when he saw me in a hospital hallway. His name was Walter Beaumont. He was 78 years old, and he had driven from his home in Oakville to Toronto that day for a cardiology appointment at Street Michaels, which was why he was in the building at all. He had been diagnosed with a heart condition 2 months earlier, he told me, and the diagnosis had shaken something loose in him. There were things he had left undone. There was one thing in particular that had weighed on him for 47 years. He asked if I had time to sit. I had nowhere to be. We found a pair of chairs in a quiet corner of the ground floor lobby, near the window that looks out onto Bond Street, and Walter Beaumont told me about my father. In the winter of 1977, Walter was 30 years old and on the verge of losing everything. He had started a small electrical contracting business in Sudbury 2 years earlier, very small, just him and one other man doing residential wiring for new builds going up around the edge of the city. Business had been promising, but then a larger job he had counted on fell through. A supplier dispute left him holding an invoice he could not pay, and the bank called in a short-term loan at the worst possible moment. He needed $8,000 in 2 weeks, or he would lose his business license, his equipment, and the lease on his small office space. He had already asked his family. He had already asked the bank twice. He was out of options. He was sitting at the bar at a tavern on Elgin Street. I knew the one. It had been there for decades when he found himself talking to a man on the next stool. Walter had not intended to tell a stranger his problems. It came out the way things sometimes do when you are desperate and you have had 2 beers and you are sitting next to someone who simply seems to be listening. The man on the next stool was my father. Gerald Hartley was 34 years old at the time. He and my mother had 3 children. I would have been about 7, and he was working at the garage and saving, slowly, for a house of their own. He had, Walter told me, a savings account with $8,500 in it. It had taken him 6 years to save that money. It was, in the terms of a Sudbury mechanic in 1977, a very significant sum. In today's equivalent, adjusting for inflation, it was closer to $45,000. My father went home that night, Walter said. He came back the next morning with a certified check. Walter had tried to give him a written loan agreement, a repayment schedule, collateral documentation. My father had refused all of it. He told Walter that if the business worked out, he could pay him back when he was able. If it did not work out, then they would call it a kindness and leave it at that. He said one other thing that Walter repeated to me word for word, because he had never forgotten it. He told me, Walter said, leaning forward in the lobby chair, that he had a family to take care of, so the money mattered. But he also said that a man who won't help another man when he has the means to do it has already lost something more important than money. I did not speak for a moment. I was looking at the gray February street outside the window and thinking about my father sitting at a kitchen table in Sudbury, telling my mother he had given away their savings to a man he met in a bar. I thought about what that conversation must have been like. I thought about the fact that he had never said a single word about it to any of us. Not ever, not even in the last years of his life, when we would sometimes sit with him in the Sudbury apartment, and he would talk a little more freely than he used to. He never told anyone, I said. No, Walter said. I know he didn't. I tried to find him afterwards. I'll tell you about that in a moment, but I want to tell you what happened next. Walter's business survived. Within 3 years, it had grown to 12 employees. Within 10 years, he had expanded to Sault Ste. Marie and then to Sudbury North. By the mid-90s, Beaumont Electrical was operating in 6 Ontario cities, doing commercial and industrial work, and was worth considerably more than a bar conversation in 1977 would have suggested. Walter had repaid the $8,000 within 18 months of receiving it. He had mailed a money order to the address my father had given him with a letter of thanks. The money order was cashed. The letter was never answered. In 1983, Walter had hired a man to find Gerald Hartley. The man came back with a Sudbury address that turned out to be wrong. My father had moved that year when my mother got sick and they needed a cheaper rental. In 1991, Walter tried again through a different avenue and was told my father had moved to an apartment, but the address he was given was for a Gerald Hartley in North Bay, who was a different man entirely. By then, my father was not listed, had no particular web presence, and lived quietly in a way that made him genuinely difficult to find if you did not already know him. Walter had never stopped thinking about it. He had set aside, in a holding account, an amount he considered a fair share of what Gerald Hartley's generosity had made possible. He had calculated it the way a business person calculates a debt, not just the principal, not just interest, but something closer to what the contribution had actually been worth. He had updated this figure over the years. He had never spent it. It sat in an account, untouched, waiting for the day he found the man who deserved it. When my father died, Walter had not known. He had made one more attempt to find Gerald Hartley in 2019 through a service that searched public records and was told that a Gerald Hartley born in 1,943 inches Sudbury, Ontario, had died in 2013. Walter told me that when he read that, he felt a grief he had not expected for a man he had spoken to only once. Then he had begun to look for the family. It had taken 4 more years, one inheritance record search, and a municipal employment database that showed a Thomas Hartley working at St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto to bring Walter Beaumont to a lobby chair beside me on a Thursday afternoon in February. He reached into the inside pocket of his wool coat and took out an envelope. He held it without opening it for a moment. "I'm not a well man," he said. "My cardiologist has given me a realistic picture of what the next 2 years look like, and it's part of why I came today instead of waiting any longer. I should have found your father. I'm sorry I didn't, but I want to do now what I should have been able to do then." He handed me the envelope. Inside was a letter, on Beaumont Electrical letterhead, and a bank draft. I looked at the figure on the bank draft, and I put it down on my knee and looked at the gray street again for a long moment, because I needed to look at something ordinary. The amount was $230,000. I did not cash that bank draft for 6 weeks. I brought it home to my Scarborough apartment and put it on the kitchen table and made myself a cup of tea and sat looking at it for a long time. Then I put it in the drawer where I kept my important documents, between my passport and a photograph of Margaret, and I went to bed and did not sleep well. I was not suspicious of Walter Beaumont. I had looked him up that same evening. Beaumont Electrical was a real company, easily found, with a long history in Ontario, and Walter himself appeared in several old business articles from the 90s and early 2000s. Everything he had told me was verifiable, and I verified it carefully over the following days. I spoke to a lawyer, a quiet man in Scarborough who handled estate matters, and who looked over Walter's letter and the bank draft and confirmed that it was legitimate, that there were no conditions attached, no legal entanglement, nothing to sign away. What I needed the 6 weeks for was something else. I needed to decide what kind of man I was going to be. Because my brother Raymond called me 3 weeks after I met Walter. I do not know how Raymond found out. I had not told anyone. Walter's letter was private, but Raymond had a way of knowing things. Or perhaps he had heard it from someone at the hospital. Or perhaps it was simply the kind of coincidence that feels like it has meaning when it happens. He called on a Sunday afternoon, which was unusual, and his voice was the careful, measured voice he used when he wanted something. He said he had heard I had come into some money. He was not accusatory. He was warm, even. He asked how I was doing, said he had been thinking about me, mentioned that Carol sent her love, and then, gently, he moved toward the point, which was that our father's estate had perhaps not been divided as fairly as it should have been, that he had been thinking about that he felt there was something owed to me, and that if I was now in a position to perhaps look at things differently, there might be a conversation to have about all of it. I let him talk. I did not interrupt him. When he was finished, I said that I appreciated the call and that I would think about what he had said. Then I hung up and sat in my kitchen and thought about my father, who had given away 6 years of savings to a man he met once, because he had the means to help and chose to use it. I thought about what my father's money had built, not just Walter's business, but the 12 employees who fed their families, the commercial buildings wired across northern Ontario, the 47 years of compounding consequence that began with a certified check and a refusal to take collateral. I thought about Raymond and Carol. I thought about what they had taken. I thought about whether I was the kind of man who made them account for it, or the kind who let it go. I thought about it for 3 more weeks. Then I made 3 decisions. The first was that I called Raymond back and told him, politely and clearly, that I had considered his suggestion and that there would be no conversation about money. I told him that what had come to me because of our father's character, and that our father's character was not something Raymond had ever shown much interest in honoring. I did not raise my voice. I did not list grievances. I said what I had to say, and I wished him well, and I meant it, in the way that you can mean someone well, while also meaning to have very little further to do with them. The second was that I called Walter Beaumont. I had his number from the letter. I called to tell him that I had cashed the bank draft, and to thank him in a way I had not been able to do properly in the hospital lobby. We spoke for nearly an hour. He told me more about the years he had spent trying to find my father, and I told him things about my father that I thought he would want to know, that Gerald Hartley had been a decent man his entire life, that he had raised 3 children, mostly alone after my mother's illness, that he had retired without fanfare and died without drama, which was exactly how he would have wanted it. Walter was quiet for a long time after I said that. Then he said, "I always knew he was that kind of man. You can tell sometimes, in a single conversation." The third decision took me the longest to make, and it is the one I am most certain about. There is a community organization in Scarborough called the Bridgepoint Neighbors Fund. It was started by a group of volunteers in the 90s, and it helps older adults in the East End of Toronto with things the social system does not quite cover: emergency dental, winter clothing, transportation to medical appointments, that kind of thing. Small things that are not small at all to the people who need them. I had heard about it from a woman at the hospital who volunteered there on weekends. I contacted them in April. I told them I wanted to make a significant donation and that I wanted it used to establish something ongoing, something with a name attached to it. We worked out the details over several meetings. The language we settled on for the fund was simple: the Gerald Hartley Community Support Fund, for older adults in Scarborough who need help with the things that fall through the cracks. The donation I made was $180,000. I kept $50,000 for myself, enough to leave the hospital job if my body asked me to, enough to visit Derek in Calgary and Patricia in Vancouver and not worry about the airfare, enough to feel, for the first time in a long time, that the years ahead were something to look forward to rather than something to endure. I still think about my father most days. I think about him sitting on that bar stool in Sudbury in 1977, listening to a stranger in trouble and deciding quietly, with no audience and no expectation of credit, to do the thing he could do. I think about how he went home that night and presumably talked to my mother, and how she agreed, because she was that kind of woman too, and how neither of them ever mentioned it to their children in all the years that followed. He was not a complicated man. I had that right. But I had underestimated what uncomplicatedness, in the right direction, can build over a lifetime. Walter Beaumont and I have had dinner twice since February. He is a good man who carried a debt for 47 years because he believed it was the right thing to do. There are not many people like that. There are not many people like my father, either. I am trying, at 64, to be a little more like both of them. I am not sure I will manage it, but I think my father would say that trying honestly and without an audience is the point. And if you are listening to this from somewhere in this country, from a small city in northern Ontario, or a suburb west of Toronto, or a province away, and you are thinking about a parent you lost before you fully understood them, I want to say this: you may not know everything they did. You may not know what they gave away quietly, what they said to strangers, what they built without taking credit. That is not a small thing, to live that way. It is, I think, the largest thing there is. Did you enjoy my story? And where in Canada are you listening from?